When people talk, listen, man, I'm going to raise that red flag.
This narrative, especially after 1 year.
1 year.
One bad year. It's one big splash move. And because I don't think people understand how much cap space we can create.
Alex, I want to ask you, because you're a very humble person.
And I'm never going to be right about anything.
Yeah.
I was right.
What's up, y'all? So, I've been pretty bummed out that every time I get on here, I have to give bad news about things. So, I wanted to just do a kind of uplifting episode, and again, this is just really loud in my ear. So, okay, hopefully that's better. So. This is what I want to do. So there's been a kind of consistent downtrend of what we think about Cam Newton. And I've consistently, every single time I have the chance, I say, Cam Newton in 2015 is the greatest quarterback I've ever seen, ever. In one season, Cam Newton in 2015 is the greatest quarterback I've ever seen, ever. And I say that, and I think it just kind of gets laughed off because people don't remember because he didn't win the Super Bowl. And he kind of doesn't get any credit by the media. The media doesn't talk about him at all. And when they do, you got people like Jason McIntyre saying that Dak Prescott has had a better career than Cam Newton. So I just want to remind you the season that Cam Newton had. So, finally, after 3 years in the league, the Panthers give Cam Newton a number one wide receiver. They draft Kelvin Benjamin in the first round. And immediately, Cam Newton makes this dude a star. So, his first year, Kelvin Benjamin has 1,008 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns. Immediately. So in 2015, they think they have Kelvin Benjamin coming into the year. But then he tears his ACL. So you're taking away, and usually rookies don't break out. Second year wide receivers break out. So this is almost like you're losing Terry McLaurin of last year. Terry McLaurin of last year had 1,002 yards and 4 touchdowns. Kelvin Benjamin had 1,008 yards and 9 touchdowns. And you saw the jump that Terry had. That's kind of the jump that I imagine Benjamin would have had, right? Because second year, they're more familiar with their quarterback, yada, 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 yada. So we're taking away 1,008 yards and 9 touchdowns. So you have Cam Newton, who has this team of no number one receiver. They end up getting Ted Ginn, who has never had a 1,000-yard receiver season. He's never been to a Pro Bowl. And that's your number one wide receiver. You have Jericho Cotchery, who's 32 years old and basically a guy. And you have Philly Brown, who played in the league for 3 years. That's his starting receiver core. Then you have a tight end, and I'm not saying it just to say it, but Greg Olsen says it. His career was changed because of Cam Newton. When he came over from the Bears, he was bad. He was a first-round draft pick, but he did not live up to it with the Bears. So he came over, and now this tight end, who's probably, at that point in time, you had Jimmy Graham, you had Gronkowski, you had Travis Kelce. He's probably like 4th or 5th best tight end in the league with Cam Newton. Not with the Bears, but with Cam Newton. So this is your receiving core that you have, right? At the end of the year, as far as defensive goes, they have a good defense. They have the 5th best scoring defense and the 6th best yards allowed defense. But that is the Legion of Boom is number 1 by a mile, and the Cardinals are ahead of them as far as defenses go. So Cam has the 3rd best defense in his conference, and he has no weapons. D'Angelo Williams leaves before that year, and he's going to Pittsburgh. So you have Jonathan Stewart and guys, basically. Right? So with this, this is what Cam does. Cam is 2nd in passing touchdowns. He is 2nd to Tom Brady. Tom Brady throws the ball. Tom Brady, who just won a Super Bowl, he ends up being 2nd in MVP this year, this in 2015. He wins an MVP 2 years later. He throws the ball 624 times and has 36 touchdowns. Cam Newton throws it 296 times and gets 35 touchdowns. More than less than half of the amount of attempts to get 35 touchdown passes next to Tom Brady, who is probably the greatest quarterback of all time, just came off a Super Bowl, 2nd in the MVP, and wins the MVP 2 years later. Not only that, he's 21st in interceptions. So he's not throwing a lot of interceptions, and he's throwing a lot of touchdowns. He also rushes for 10 touchdowns, which is 2nd behind Adrian Peterson. That guy, Adrian Peterson. Adrian Peterson runs for 327 attempts. 327. Cam Newton runs for 132 attempts. So the efficiency for touchdowns that he has is absolutely bananas. Bananas. Cam Newton was 38th in rushing attempts and was 2nd with 10 touchdowns rushing compared to 11 for Adrian Peterson. So we say, I'm just going to go back to weapons, right? So let's talk about who he's going against in the division. The Cardinals and the Legion of Boom, who was just in the playoffs the year before. The Cardinals have Larry Fitzgerald, who had 1,215 yards and 9 touchdowns. John Brown, who had 1,003 yards, 7 touchdowns. Malcolm Floyd, who had 849 yards and 6 touchdowns. David Johnson, who had 1,025 yards and 7 touchdowns. And CJ2K, shout out ECU, for 872 yards and 3 touchdowns. That offense was insanely stacked. And then you had not only the best defense in the league, but you had Doug Baldwin, who led the league in touchdown catches that year for Seattle. And then if you say, let's talk about the Broncos. All right, I have Demaryius Thomas, who's a first-round pick, went for 1,304 yards and 6 touchdowns. Emmanuel Sanders went for 1,135 yards and 6 touchdowns. So that's his competition. And with all of that competition, he leads the league in overall touchdowns. With a worse defense, as far as statistics, to the Broncos, the Seahawks, and the Cardinals. Right? How many 15-1 or better teams can you think of that have ever existed? Ever? Can you think of more than 3? I can't. I really can't. I can think of the Pats. The year they went 18-0 before the Super Bowl, and I can think of the Packers when they went 15-1. And that's it. But that Patriots team had Randy Moss on it. That Packers team had Randall Cobb, Jordy Nelson. Like, Cam's doing this with Ted Ginn, Jericho Cotchery, and Philly Brown. Ted Ginn had 739 yards and 10 touchdowns. He caught less than half of his targets. He was second in the NFL in drops. So if you just think about that, second in the NFL in drops, how many more yards, how many more touchdowns could Cam Newton have had? So you had Jericho Cotchery had 580 yards, and John Brown, who had 497 yards. Cam Newton was number one in rushing touchdowns on his team, obviously, because he was second in the NFL. And he was second on his team in rushing yards. He had 132 attempts, and Jonathan Stewart had 242 attempts to get 989 yards and 6 touchdowns. Jonathan Stewart had 110 more attempts to gain 350 more yards and 4 less touchdowns. Not only this, Cam Newton this year was 4th in first downs rushing. Adrian Peterson had 327 attempts, and he was first in first downs with 72. 72 first downs and 327 attempts. Cam Newton, basically a third of that as far as attempts, and had 59 first downs. That is 13 less first downs on 200 less attempts. Not only this, Cam Newton is tied for the league lead in game-winning drives. Tied for the league lead. He did it against Indianapolis, where it should have been a walk-off because he throws a dime to Ted Ginn and he drops it. And then he still has the capability to have his team drive down and kick a field goal. He did it against Seattle. He throws a touchdown pass. I can't remember how the order is, but one touchdown pass was with Greg Olsen and one was with Cotchery. He does it against the Giants, but that's not a touchdown pass. That's a walk-off field goal. I was actually at that game in New York. In New Orleans, where he has 497 yards and a game-winning drive. I think that one was the one to Cotchery, and Seattle was Olsen. I can't remember. But 4 game-winning drives, and against the Giants, it was game 14 where they'd already clinched basically, because the second was the Cardinals with 13. They were 13-3 at that time. Panthers were 13-0. So they're on the road against the Giants and still pull off the win. The next week they lost, so they were on road to road. They lost by 7 points. A big reason for that to the Falcons. They were 14-0 going into this. The week before the Giants, they beat the Falcons 38-0 at home. They go to the Giants. They have this intense game. And then they go road to the Falcons. And then Julio Jones pulls this insane catch over Luke Kuechly that changes the whole dynamic of the game. They had already clinched to that point. It was whatever. This is a 16-0 team, basically. And then everybody's saying that they're not who we think. They were dogs against Seattle and Arizona, and they blew them both out in the playoffs. And then I went to the Super Bowl and watched them play. That Denver defense was just insane. I mean, it really came down to 5 plays maybe, the Denver game. Neither one can move the ball against the other. And strip sack 2 times, basically. Which is another thing. I was there. I was in the end zone. I saw the fumble that Cam Newton didn't jump on. Cam Newton had no chance to get that ball. You only see one angle ever. And it's from where I was sitting, the right sideline. But if you look at it straight on, Cam's 5 yards away from the ball. DeMarcus Ware has his hand on the ball basically before Cam even can get a chance to jump on it. I don't understand why we want to create the narrative that Cam Newton is bad, not a team player, doesn't put his body on the line. I understand he doesn't help himself because he says ridiculous things, he wears ridiculous clothes, and he doesn't defend himself. And his teammates don't defend him. The only player that I know that actually comes out and says anything about Cam is Greg Olsen. He said, Greg Olsen said, my career isn't a career without Cam Newton. But honestly, he's the only one worth saying that about. Because Ted Ginn's nobody cares what Ted Ginn has to say, or Kotchery, or any other pass catcher that Cam's had over the years. He had DJ Moore for a second. But can you imagine 15 wins? Like we saw the Chiefs do it, and we say the Chiefs aren't like a real contender until we always do it every year. I don't know why. But they have Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, DeAndre Hopkins, Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy, great offensive line, a great defense, and they won 15 games. Cam Newton had Ted Ginn, Jericho Cotchery, Philly Brown, Greg Olsen, Jonathan Stewart, probably the worst skill players in the league at that time as a whole, and took that team to 15-1 in the best offense in the league, the most touchdowns of any quarterback in the league. He had the second most by 1 passing touchdowns and the second most by 1 rushing touchdowns that year. The definition of putting a team on your back. Because the defense was good, but they were 5th and 6th in respective categories, where Denver was ahead of them, Seattle was ahead of them, Cardinals were ahead of them. And Cam won the NFC. We gotta remember, we can't even put these weird tweets out that say, who would you rather have in the last minute in the fourth quarter? Bryce, Delhomme, or Cam? It's just diminishing Cam. And we can't let the national media pundits say Dak Prescott had a better career than Cam or was better than Cam. I mean, people just say it. And people take it seriously because Cam has kind of made himself into a little bit of a joke. But you gotta keep watching that film of 2015 Cam, and we gotta keep on letting people know how great he was, because that season's starting to get lost. And I tend to think that it would probably get lost even if they did win the Super Bowl. And when I was at the Super Bowl and I saw Cam not fall on this ball because he wasn't even close to it, no one around us said anything. No one. It wasn't even a thing until the next day. We saw it on TV. And we were all like, what? What? I don't remember that at all. I don't remember that at all. I remember the Kotchery catch that they called not a catch. But I remember that. You won't hear anything about that, though. I don't know, man. But I wanted to bring something positive to light of happiness because, man, that was the happiest I've ever been watching any single season I've ever watched, ever. As a Hornets fan, as a ECU Pirates fan, as a Panthers fan. That was fun. That was domination. Cam Newton was banana. I don't think we'll ever see that again. Ever see that level of dominance. 15-1. 15-1. You can say that Mahomes threw all these balls, and you can say that Lamar Jackson had all these crazy runs. They didn't do it the level Cam did that year. And he did it with no one. Greatest show on turf. Bruce, Holt. Still didn't equal what Cam was doing. Tom Brady, 2008. And they're doing like Hall of Famers. Cam had Ted Ginn. Alright, that's it. I just wanted to have like a fun episode because that became a narrative on Twitter recently, and I wanted to just talk about Cam rather than tweet about him because those get lost and nobody cares. Alright, till next time.